I invite you to rise for the proclamation of the gospel this evening that comes from the 18th chapter of St. Luke. The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 18th chapter. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, "In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people taught. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, 'Grant me justice against my adversary.' For some time he refused. But finally he said to himself, 'Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" The Gospel of the Lord. Please be seated. Gosh, as I was listening to Timothy tonight when Bree was reading that was really grabbing me. That part where he says, "Oh, the people with itchy ears will surround themselves with teachers that they want to listen to satisfy their desires." We don't live in the midst of that, do we? We're open to the truth that comes to us in our gospel tonight. And it's interesting. I think our gospel tonight comes to us in the first reading as well. There's good news in that first reading. And I want to explore this story from Genesis with you a little bit tonight, because I think it's one of those, what I would call an archetypal story. I love this story about Jacob, Yaakov, because I think when we listen to his story, we can find ourselves in it on lots of levels. And I want to just explore it with you tonight with the question, how is his story like your story right now? So Jacob, if you remember all the way back to the beginning, was the twin son of Isaac and Rebekah. Remember? And when Rebekah was pregnant, she started to feel really lousy. And she went and talked to one of the elders of the town, and the elder said, "Oh, guess what? You have twins, and they're fighting, they're wrestling in the womb. And that's why you feel so lousy." Anybody ever experienced that? No? Okay. Thought maybe. So she's told, and guess what? They're going to spend their whole lives wrestling with each other. And so when it comes time for her to birth her twin sons, the first one comes out, Esau, and he's all covered with red hair. And he's lifting out of the womb, and there's a hand clasped onto his heel. And it's his brother. And his brother, whose name becomes Jacob, is hanging on to his heel. He's not willing to let him go, right? And Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew, means one who hangs on to the heel, supplanter, deceiver, tricker. One who is always nipping at the heel, trying to change things up to get the advantage. And that's how it plays out in the Hebrew culture, those named Yaakov. So his life is one of trickery. And later on we hear the story, in that culture, especially in farm families back then. And we're talking back in about 1700 BC, in that farm family. The oldest son would get the birthright, would get the responsibility from the father to take over the family, to be the father's place for the family. And that was supposed to be Esau. But when Isaac had become old and blind, Rebekah helps her favorite son Jacob to trick Esau out of his blessing and birthright. And so one day, Esau goes out hunting, and he's going to come back so Isaac can give him the blessing. That's the intention. But in the meantime, Rebekah covers Jacob's arms with hair, with sheep's hair. Remember this story? And he comes in to his father, and he says, I'm ready for the blessing. Here's the wonderful stew that I've made for you with the meat that I got. Rebekah had really cooked it. And he says, oh, you sound like Jacob, but you smell like Esau. Come over here. And he rubs his hands on him. He says, oh, you feel like Esau. You must be my son Esau. And he gives his blessing to Jacob. And when Esau gets back, he's furious because his birthright, his blessing has been taken from him. And Isaac says, I'm really sorry, Esau, but the blessing has been bestowed. I can't tell you what your future is going to be, but you will serve your younger son. And Esau is furious, mad. He's breathing murderous threats against Jacob. And Rebekah becomes fearful for Jacob, and she helps him escape. And because of that discord, because of his deceit, because of his trickery, he has to flee his family and his town, and he is a man on the run. He goes up to where his mother was from, up in modern-day Syria, Aram. And over into Haran, and where his mother's family is from. And there he finds a place to live. And eventually he marries 2 wives. And he has children by 2 more of their servants. And time passes. But all of the time that he's gone, that he's on the run, Jacob, he's burdened by what he's done. He's burdened by the fact that he's removed from his promised land, from his home, from his family, and he longs to be back. And so he decides, finally, after a number of years, to come back to his homeland. And he hears that Esau is coming up to get him. And so Jacob tries to anticipate this, because he is sure that Esau is still going to kill him. And so he sends gifts down to Esau ahead of him with messages from his servants. Here, receive these gifts, Esau. And Jacob is filled with fear as he comes home. And we hear about this story tonight, where he arrives through the northern part of Canaan, his homeland. It's called the Gilead. And he passes through that area to go and meet Esau. He knows he has to face the one he has deceived, his brother. And he's filled with fear. He's scared as heck, right, Summer? And he comes to the river with his wives and children and his flocks and his possessions. And the river Jabbok, I was just there in February, is the border between his homeland of Gilead and the next country to the south, Ammon, where the modern city of Amman, Jordan is. That's one region closer to the threat that is coming against him and his brother. And he stops at the edge of the river. And he says, how can I preserve my legacy? How can I make sure that I live on? Even if Esau kills me, how can I make sure that my legacy continues on? And so he sees the river and he says, I've got to cross the river. I've got to leave what I've hungered for. I've got to leave my home to enter into something new. This is the only way I will be able to make peace with my brother. And yet he stops on the side of the river and he sends his wives and children across and his servants and his flocks, and he splits them. He divides them into 2 camps. So that if one gets overtaken, if Esau discovers one, perhaps the other will survive. His legacy will continue on. And Jacob is left on the side of the river by himself. And you know, when I think about Jacob, I imagine that he was there by himself in his isolation, a divided man, just like he had divided his family. He was divided inside of himself, wasn't he? He was wrestling inside of himself with his sin, with his deceit, with his past actions, with his dishonesty, with his hunger for family. He was a divided man. And he was by himself. And he enters into the darkness of that night. His fear overwhelming him, his insecurities in front of him, the threat coming down upon him, his future unsure. And we're told that he wrestles through the night. We're not clear who he wrestles with. It's called a man, an entity. The word is actually Elohim, which means a divine spirit. He's wrestling with something that's greater than him, a mystery that is beyond him. And yet it's also a part of himself, isn't it? Those voices, those insecurities inside of himself, he's wrestling with his history, with himself, with the mystery of it all. And I don't know how many of you have ever woken up in the middle of the night wrestling with something. I don't know, I was thinking back to middle school. I used to wake up all the time the night before a test. And I would be anxious that I didn't know enough, that I hadn't studied enough, that if I didn't do well enough, somebody would be mad at me or I would let somebody down. I was always worried about what people were thinking about me. And I would wake up in the middle of the night. And I can remember sometimes when I was in high school, I would wake up and feel like there was a presence in the room that was after me. You know, it felt heavy and dark. And I had a teacher one time who told me, when that happens, just cry out, in the name of Jesus, be gone. And I remember doing that. But I would wrestle sometimes with the anxieties and the fears and the insecurities. And I think that's partly what Jacob was wrestling with. He was wrestling with that history. And you know, he doesn't overcome it. It's not resolved. He doesn't fully rely on the divine. He doesn't gain complete security from his wrestling with the divine. Neither overtakes the other, but he's injured. He's wounded in the struggle, in the wrestling. He's been wrestling his whole life. For what? For what? Against his brother, against life, against his homeland, against his father. He's been wrestling his whole life for what? To surround himself with people, with herds, with wealth. For what? He's now a divided man. And he's wrestling with this divine image. And do you get that? It says, dawn was starting to break. And so, to weaken him, the divine spirit punches his hip out, right? This is a permanent injury he's going to have. Causes him to limp. Now everybody can see his weakness. But what's Jacob doing? Do you have this picture in your mind? He's hanging onto the heel of the divine, isn't he? The divine says, let me go. Daybreak's coming. And he says, no, not until you bless me. Isn't that what he was wrestling for the whole time? Was for the blessing? To believe he was enough? To believe that who he was enough? To believe that he mattered? And the divine image says to him, what's your name? And for the first time we hear Jacob says, I am Jacob. I am the deceiver. I am the trickster. I am the one who supplants, who takes away. And in admitting that, in claiming his name, he shows the humility of that wound, the humility of his inability to overcome, the humility that says, I'm Jacob. And the divine says to him, no, you're not Jacob. That's not who you are. You are Israel. You are the one who has wrestled with God, and you have wrestled with humanity. You've wrestled with your humanity, and you are alive. You've seen God face to face, and you are alive. Because see, what people believe is that if you see God face to face, you're dead. And here's Yaakov, Israel, saying, I've seen God, and I'm alive. My life has been preserved. And then we hear that he lets go, and the divine image lets go, and he starts to see the sun come up. The new day, the resurrection day for Jacob, now Israel. Dead to Jacob, now the new life of Israel, one who has wrestled with God and with humanity, and he is a new person, and he will go on to be the father of nations. But I think if we stay with that, Jacob could not have been the father of nations if he hadn't had this night of wrestling. If we don't go through the wrestling in our life, if we don't at some point admit to God who people say we are, who people have named us, so that we can hear God say back to us, no, that's not who you are. You are my beloved child. You are the one whose life I have preserved. And see, I don't know if you know the next part of the story, but Jacob leaves Israel, leaves Peniel, the place where he has seen God face to face. He leaves there and he goes and meets his brother Esau. Esau, who's coming upon him with 400 men. The man who struck fear in his heart, the one who he's sure was going to end his life. And Esau comes to him and embraces him. Esau already knew he was going to reconcile with him. Esau was not holding it over Jacob. Jacob was divided over Jacob. And if Jacob hadn't gone through that night of wrestling, would he have been able to accept his brother's forgiveness? Would he have been able to go forth from that place to bring about new life? I don't think so. So how is this your story? What is the river that you are being asked to cross from the old into the new? What is the wrestling that you are engaged in? What's the name that you want to say before your God? What is the blessing that you want to ask for today? How are you experiencing the resurrection? Because I think Jacob is just like Jesus the Christ in his experience of this world. He lived and he suffered and he was wounded. And in the midst of his woundedness, he met God. He died to himself that he could become a new person. And the sun rose upon him. And a nation emerged because of that. Who is gaining life from your experience of forgiveness? Who's part of your family brought together now in reconciliation, in love?